Deborah Bricker Balken is almost always described as an independent curator and writer. Independent curator means that she organizes exhibitions for various institutions without being under the control of any one of them. Independent writer means she's freelance, so that the writing has to find its place anew each time. She's trained in art history, but does not hold a permanent academic post, preferring to visit various schools, most recently the Rhode Island School of Design. Her many books include Abstract Expressionism, Movements in Modern Art, Debating American Modernism, Stieglitz, Duchamp, and the New York Avant-Garde, Dove O'Keeffe, Circles of Influence, John Storrs, Machine Aid's Modernist, and 2 books on Philip Guston, focusing on his poem Pictures and also on his amazing Poor Richard drawings. Most of these books are connected to exhibitions that she's curated. She's also organized shows of the works of Mark Tobey, Arthur Dove, Alfredo Jar, and the Park Avenue Cubists at the Gray Gallery. For the past 10 years, she's devoted herself to the writing of an in-depth critical biography of the writer Harold Rosenberg that will eventually be published by the University of Chicago Press. Deborah is a meticulous and insightful scholar, so her accounts of Rosenberg's times, he lived from 1906 to 1978, will be valuable in themselves. But there's another reason that many of us anxiously await her book, and that is that her analysis of Rosenberg's writings and the controversies that surrounded them will shed light on her own current crises and conundrums. As she has said, quote, Rosenberg's antipathy to a critical outlook that took its cues from T.S. Eliot and Clive Bell's construction of significant form that possessed no analysis of political or social history resulted in his declaration that art criticism has lost its authority as a literary genre. Bingo. Please welcome Debra Bricker Balken.
Good evening. Let's see, just this mic. Very happy to be here. Thanks, Levi, for the lovely introduction. Tonight I'm going to focus on Harold Rosenberg's first collection of writings. That is a book that appeared in 1959 that he titled The Tradition of the New. And I'm primarily interested in the critical reception to this book, the widespread discussion that it generated in art and literary circles from 1959 through the early 1960s, as well as in the fallout to the publication. You'll hear in the course of my lecture that there was one essay in particular that was contained in this book that became a polarizing text. Along the way, I also hope to convey or provide you with something of Rosenberg's very elusive but key concept of action painting. And for the purposes of my talk this evening, I've divided it into 3 sections and with a short coda to follow that I'll refer to as I move through the text. You can hear me, right? Okay. In 1959, Harold Rosenberg brought out his first anthology of writing, a collection of essays that he provocatively titled The Tradition of the New. The book gathered together pieces that he had written from the 1930s through the 1950s for publications such as Partisan Review, Commentary, the Kenyon Review, as well as newer journals such as Dissent, and included tracts such as The Fall of Paris, French Silence, and American Poetry, in addition to his key revisionist pieces on Marxism, such as The Resurrected Romans. This sampling underscored Rosenberg's primary identity, both as a poet and literary and political commentator, at least through the 25-year period that the book covered. Yet, when the reviews of The Tradition of the New appeared, most writers singled out one essay, that is, The American Action Painters, a text that appeared in Art News in 1952 and which had a far-reaching impact, galvanizing as it did a loose-knit group of New York artists into a collective. And while action was a wholly intangible concept, one that knew no material component or form, many mid-century modernist artists felt aligned with Rosenberg's declaration that the canvas represented, quote, an arena in which to act, end of quote, taken, that is, by the existential overtones of a metaphor that centered on the artist's subjectivity. Yet, in addition to the concept of an arena or a stage for the artist to act out his or her individuality, the American Action Painters was decidedly polemical, if not a contentious text, one for which any visual analysis of art was deemed irrelevant in the early 1950s. As Rosenberg stated, quote, form, color, composition, drawing are auxiliaries, any one of which can be dispensed with, end of quote. Rather, in the alienated act of painting, Rosenberg found much more to glean about the state of post-war American art, unlike the formalist spin of a critic such as Clement Greenberg, who by 1952 had become New York's most visible interpreter of art. The modern artist's distrust of tradition offered more answers, Rosenberg thought, to the complex task of exerting one's originality than the prevailing theories that hinged on the discussion of form. There were more pressing questions to be asked, Rosenberg believed, about the future of the modernist project. What, for example, were the implications of producing art in an increasingly conformist era in which the proliferation of the corporation had redounded in endless homogeneity, felt not only in the marketplace, but within the museum and the academy? Moreover, could the avant-garde maintain its anti-authoritarian stance and preserve its originality in the wake of the buoyant and giddy consumerism of the United States in the early 1950s? Had modernism suffered an end or collapse, with the result that painting had been robbed of its anxiety and urgency? One of the reviewers of the tradition of the new, Rosenberg's long-term friend, Mary McCarthy, whom he met in the late 1930s when she was an editor at the Partisan Review, noted that the essays in the book, however seemingly diverse, were unified by a single narrative thread. As McCarthy observed, quote, all of his life, as these essays shows, he has been influenced only in action, in the act, a favorite word with him, succinct as a pistol shot. Before action painting, there was the action poem, and before that, political action or Marxism, end of quote. Whatever this consistency, McCarthy, like most reviewers, focused on the American Action Painters, suggesting that the essay was not only much discussed when the book was released in 1959, but that it still had a lingering currency. McCarthy clearly sensed that not only had the text redoubled Rosenberg's considerable readership in 1959, but it also had positioned him as an art critic. And while she playfully quibbled with his application of action to art, wondering, quote, how can you hang an event on the wall, end of quote, she noted its considerable influence on artists. There was a certain irony, however, to her observation that Rosenberg was now perceived as a critic of art. For after the American Action Painters had appeared in Art News in 1952, Rosenberg had written only a handful of essays on the subject. His writing was still given largely to more topical subjects, such as the demise of communism in the United States and what he thought of as the trumped-up spectacle of the Cold War, on which he ruminated for political forums such as Commentary and Dissent. This is Harold Rosenberg as an Action Critic by Philip Guston. The opportunity to write for Art News was clearly there, especially given the widespread critical reception to his inaugural piece, yet he remained distant from the genre of art criticism and from the art press, at least as an ongoing regular contributor. Unlike the artist Fairfield Porter and poets such as James Schuyler, Frank O'Hara, and John Ashbery, who were the mainstays of Art News, along with a new generation of curators and art historians such as E.C. Goosen and Robert Rosenblum, Rosenberg remained aloof from writing exhibition reviews. The longer format of the essay, where he could expound on the social and cultural context of art, was more compelling for him, at least through the 1950s. Through his friendship with Tom Hess, the editor of Art News, he agreed to a few discursive pieces on modern art, yet these remained episodic and infrequent. It was not until he began writing for The New Yorker in 1962 and became its official art critic in 1967 that he covered exhibitions where his pontifications on action became necessarily more compact and terse. Rosenberg, nonetheless, capitalized on his emerged identity as an art critic in 1959, a gesture that canalized the subsequent critical reception to the tradition of the new. While the book was organized into 4 thematic sections, he foregrounded his essays on art, which subtly conveyed a priority over those on poetics, Marxism, and cultural politics. Withstanding this order, he nonetheless cautioned his readers in the introduction to the volume that, quote, criticism cannot divide itself into literary criticism, art criticism, social criticism, but must begin in establishing the terms of conflict between the actual work or event and its illusory context, end of quote. He was telling us then that he was collapsing these old essentialist boundaries to pick away at and expose the crisis that confronted the socially attuned artist and writer. But in settling on a title for his corpus, he slyly invoked his recurrent beef with formalism, suggesting that style, as an organizing construct in criticism, was now so institutionalized that it no longer possessed any weight or vitality. More than that, the title suggested that the revolutionary content of modernist art had come to an end, that an advanced art no longer operated on the margins of culture and now represented a tradition or thing of the past. More resoundingly and transparently, the book conveyed also that the title conveyed more that Rosenberg's book was largely a book about art, a statement that reinforced his new professional identity and interest. That Willem de Kooning designed the cover with its energetically scribbled title in black and white furthered the perception that Rosenberg was now fully engaged as an art critic. Around the time that The Tradition of the New was published, Rosenberg had begun to write a few monographic pieces on artists. In 1957, he brought out an essay on Hans Hofmann in Art News, in which he applied his term action painting to the artist's canvases, whereby he gauged his effectiveness to, quote, restore art to an ethic beyond mass ideals and taste, end of quote. Hofmann had not only passed this morality test, but was exemplary in Rosenberg's estimation. That is, he refused to conform to the prevailing aesthetic status quo through his unforeseen novel reworking of abstract shapes. After his piece on Hoffman, he moved on to Aaron Siskin, for whom he wrote the introduction to his first book of photographs, which was released in 1959 by Horizon Press, the same publisher of The Tradition of the New. There, Rosenberg likened Siskin's work to, quote, reproductions of advanced contemporary painting, end of quote, that involved the same, quote, act of choice, end of quote. In the photographer's decidedly abstract compositions, Rosenberg located a defiant departure from the prevalent practice of straight photography, one that similarly spoke of his morality, of a decision to forego the interests of the marketplace. Moreover, shortly after The Tradition of the New appeared, Rosenberg also tackled Jackson Pollock in Art News, largely to counter Pollock's assumption that he had pilfered the idea of action from him, to broadcast more fully that he had been involved with the metaphor since the early 1930s. And I should mention that the American Action Painters was a text that named no names, and hence Pollock thought that he was Rosenberg's exemplar of action. Many figures did, actually. Well, Rosenberg conceded that Pollock's painting embodied action and that he was one of the artists that he had in mind as he wrote his signature text. He didn't think that Pollock had it in him to articulate the philosophical rudiments of the concept, what with, quote, literary discoveries outside of his range, end of quote. Pollock was no intellectual, Rosenberg reckoned, too bound up in his own self-mythology, someone who had become a, quote, abstract Buffalo Bill, end of quote, through his redundant references to his birthplace in Cody, Wyoming, incapable of advancing sophisticated thought. In fact, Rosenberg went on the record in Art News to state that Pollock was so caught up in enacting his own legend, so interested in, quote, playing cowboy, end of quote, that it was impossible to know who he really was, no matter how achieved his work. Just as The Tradition of the New was about to be released in 1959, Rosenberg wrote himself into the narrative of action painting, not only as its sole spokesman, but as a credentialed denizen of East 10th Street, the place where he lived near St. Mark's Square, which had become by the late 1950s of what he described as, quote, an artist's colony, end of quote. In a semi-autographical essay for the Art News Annual titled 10th Street, The Geography of Modern Art, he mapped out the distinctions between the neighborhood where he had lived since 1942 and the erstwhile art scene of Greenwich Village, the locale that he thought had always been, quote, an imitation Paris, a grounded Liberté or Ile-de-France, attested to be a genuine copy by the Arc de Triomphe on the Washington Square, end of quote. There's Rosenberg on Washington Square. By contrast, Rosenberg believed that 10th Street presented no opportunity for nostalgia or beautification, at least in 1959, its architecture and streets too gritty and undistinguished, still populated by pawnshops and the homeless, yet attracted to artists and gallerists who resisted the fashionable haunts of the West Village. Its individualism, as he stated, was still intact, a place that had not been sought out by writers who could vaunt its features, such as D.H. Lawrence had done for Taos and Eugene O'Neill for Provincetown. Rosenberg wrote, what he liked about 10th Street is that, quote, it belonged exclusively to painters and sculptors, end of quote. These were the figures who constituted his community and who had long since been a part of his social milieu. Still, in terms of the shifting geography of modernism, as he called it, in its ongoing reconfigurations, Rosenberg knew that the 10th Street scene would eventually expire, not to be gentrified as Greenwich Village had become, but bulldozed by developers, its real estate permanently altered. The trope became one of his many riffs on the demise of modernism itself, what with its cornerstone of authenticity done in by a marketplace that was directed by the middle class. In the notes on the contributors to the 1959 issue of the Art News Annual, where his piece on 10th Street appeared, Rosenberg was billed as, quote, an avant-garde poet, becoming an avant-garde literary and art critic and a native of the New York art scene, end of quote. Just as the tradition of the new was about to be released, Rosenberg's role as a key player on 10th Street was consolidated then, making the subsequent focus on the American action painters in the numerous reviews of the book all the more understandable. By the late 1950s, his ideas on action had not only exerted phenomenal discussion, but they had also defined him as an art critic. Section 2. Like Mary McCarthy, there were many writers who highlighted the American action painters in their coverage of the tradition of the new. With the accrued impact of the essay, most critics wanted to address its meanings as well as its ambiguities to get to the core of what action really implied and how it was conveyed in painting. Dudley Fitz, for the New York Times, for example, thought that Rosenberg had never successfully articulated what action signified, and that this opacity could have been cleared up by the mention of a few names of artists and some accompanying illustrations. Although Fitz felt that there were occasional, quote, brilliant, end of quote, passages in the book, they were brought down by Rosenberg's overwrought language and avoidance of any sustained analysis and explanation. Fitz was something of an anomaly when it came to the issue of Rosenberg's clarity, however, for there were numerous plaudits penned by predisposed journalists and colleagues who had no issue with the expression of his ideas. Chief among them was Herbert Reed, the British curator and critic, who responded in kind to the tradition of the new after initially clearing up a few differences. Reed wanted it known that he remained equally committed to, quote, the social relevance, end of quote, of modern art, just like Rosenberg, but also to its core formalist values. Rosenberg had always been adverse to any formalist interpretation of the avant-garde. Such was the narrowness of its applications in the United States, but he and Reed were on the same page when it came to extolling the subversive thrust of modernism, its will to invention, and ongoing defiance of staid pictorial conventions. Moreover, both writers were deeply interested in the existential implications of artistic practice and what it meant to be caught on the sidelines of society. In recognition of Rosenberg's independent stance, Reed dubbed him, quote, the Apollinaire of action painting, end of quote, an accolade that underscored that his notion of action went a long way in situating the authority of New York school painting, just as his French counterpart had done decades earlier for Cubism. Yet unlike the rave reception from Mary McCarthy and Herbert Reed, as well as manifold other figures such as Paul Goodman, Irving Howe, and Alfred Kazin, the tradition of the new was not universally exalted, even though it had attracted substantial coverage in both specialized journals and in the mass media. In fact, Rosenberg's collection of essays became a polarizing book, one that divided many writers, and in particular, a younger generation of art critics. As a result, it induced Rosenberg's ongoing responses and refinements of his concept of action. As he dwelt, for instance, on Mary McCarthy's witticism, quote, how can you hang an event on the wall? And he shot back in the preface to the second edition to the book in 1960, writing, quote, action painting holds up history as a supreme value to the neglect of the aesthetic. We forget the multiple existence which a painting now enjoys in separation from its physical body, its ghostly presence through reproductions and books and magazines, end of quote. the aesthetic, he now made even more patently clear, had no relevant place in the discussion of art. In other words, a painting was not just an idle thing or commodity awaiting the projection of, quote, a spectator's taste, end of quote, but a complex object whose reception was continually altered by new and successive histories. Like the facsimile, the work of art, he thought, was perpetually doomed to become a phantom of the past, the artist's intentionality never entirely retrievable. In the face of these ironies, Rosenberg asked then, how can the critic's taste effectively mediate a work of art? As the tradition of the new occupied the critical limelight for almost a 3-year period, generating ongoing discussion and reviews, Clement Greenberg had finally had enough with Rosenberg's omnipresence and could no longer contain his anger. Rosenberg had, after all, indicted style as a critical tool in the American action painters, contending, quote, the taste bureaucracies of modern art cannot grasp the human experience involved in the new action paintings. One work is equivalent to another on the basis of resemblances of surface, and the movement as a whole a modish addition to 20th century picture making, end of quote. Greenberg had been waiting for a decade to publicly avenge the American action painters, knowing that he was targeted therein. And while his reply, How Art Writing Earns Its Bad Name, originally appeared in a student-launched magazine, if you can believe it, The Second Coming, that came out of Columbia University, Stephen Spender and Melvin J. Lasky, editors of the American-financed London-based journal Encounter, knew that the piece would make for good copy and requested a condensed version where it ignited sensation, particularly since Greenberg implicated the British in contributing to Rosenberg's critical success. As if its title wasn't incendiary enough, Greenberg wanted to know why, quote, the widening gap between art and discourse solicits perversions and abortions of discourse, end of quote. How Rosenberg's existentialism could function as a guidepost. But his seething jealousy derailed any convincing riposte. For Greenberg had attributed the endurance of the American action painters to a circuitous route, namely to the English writer and curator Lawrence Alloway, who by then worked at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and who had coined the phrase pop art. The explanation was preposterous and wildly off-base, more a takedown of Alloway than an accurate account of Rosenberg's new preeminence as an art critic. Alloway had been the British correspondent for Art News from 1953 to 1957, and thereafter became the editor of Art International. In his latter capacity, he met both Rosenberg and Greenberg on his first trip to the United States in 1958. Where Alloway was once taken by Rosenberg's ideas while at Art News, he now thought there was something to Greenberg's concentration on the visual attributes of Abbeck's painting that Greenberg had been able to predict the course of abstract art and of all of its high points with, quote, extraordinary prescience and accuracy, end of quote. He later reneged on his revelation about Greenberg's authority and eventually contended that there were drawbacks to both critics' positions, that they had devolved into, quote, one half of an argument between content and form, end of quote. This characterization aside, Greenberg never forgave Allaway for questioning a key piece of his platform, his abhorrence to popular culture, the appropriations of which Allaway was deeply drawn to within contemporary art. As Greenberg sat down to review the tradition of the new in 1962, he was unable to fathom how Rosenberg had become so seemingly ascendant, how his writing was capable of influence and had reached England at that. He had, unlike Rosenberg, traveled to London in 1954 and 1959 and met with various British artists, including the painter and critic Patrick Heron, who had written for the New Statesman and served as a correspondent for the American publication The Arts Digest. Greenberg, however, expressed little interest in the British art scene and was moreover dismissive not only of Allaway, but of other critics abroad, such as Herbert Reed and David Sylvester. Heron fared better in part because he had written about Pollock with interest, but by 1959, he too had become resistant to Greenberg, largely because he was wont to give him advice as an artist, that he advised him to simplify his compositions by reducing their forms and exposing the canvas's edges. Greenberg's focus on Allaway in his review in the Tradition of the New deflected any treatment of Rosenberg's ideas of action, more interested as he was in their appeal rather than core meaning. In short, he wrote off Rosenberg's rhetoric as, quote, racy and demotic, end of quote, with Rosenberg's catchphrase action painting likened to, quote, a new dance step, end of quote. Greenberg was clearly threatened and sensed that Rosenberg had not only invaded but usurped his territory. As he later childishly complained, quote, I wrote first, then he got bigger, so now they say Rosenberg and Greenberg instead of alphabetically, end of quote. In his rebuke on Allaway and the British, he had pitched the first salvo in a feeble effort to maintain his dwindling credibility. In so doing, he also ensnared other figures, such as Michel Tapier, this is Dubuffet's characterization or caricature of Tapier, who wrote for a number of international publications and who had arranged for Pollock's first exhibition in Paris. But Greenberg regarded Tapier to be equally inadequate, not up to accounting for the visual strengths of the new American painting. Tapier was similarly passed off by Greenberg as, quote, a comedian, end of quote, a figure who had been overly seduced by Rosenberg's prospect of action and what Greenberg described as, quote, its millennial overtones, end of quote. Or put another way, Greenberg was ticked off by their joint understanding that modernism had begun to expire as an historic period in 1962, that popular culture now threatened the future of abstract painting in which he had a deep investment. Greenberg clearly wanted to assert himself as one of the few remaining tastemakers, a writer who still had it in him to redirect the discourse on art and center its focus on episodes that related to compositional purity and breakthrough. He therefore implicated most critics in his bombast on Rosenberg and even bagged Robert Goldwater, a renowned art historian with whom he had once been close, as not having a sufficient, quote, grounding of aesthetics, end of quote. Part of Greenberg's rage stemmed from the more modest reception to his own collection of essays, Art and Culture, that appeared in 1961, and which opened with his signature piece, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, an essay written in 1939 that dwelled on the contrasts between the authenticity of modernist art and its parasitic opposite, mass culture. Greenberg's book failed to stir even lighthearted interest, however, with writers such as Tom Hess and Robert Goldwater, unable to muster the kind of praise and scrutiny that had been piled on to the tradition of the new. By this point, Greenberg's elaboration of the spurious traits of popular art was deemed overly pious, too rehearsed in contemporary writing to have any relevance, all of which contributed to the pinched enthusiasm of his Summa, or life's work. As Robert Goldwater wrote in his review in Art and Culture in Partisan Review, quote, art has meaning beyond the purely formal relationship of its internal parts, end of quote. In other words, there were other interpretive models that were far more inclusive. Goldwater, in the end, located too many landmines in Greenberg's reading of history. His a priori assumption that the medium of painting was knit together stylistically through time and possessed, as Goldwater questioned, quote, an inevitable historical process, end of quote, broke down on too many occasions. The path that Greenberg had projected from analytical cubism to Jackson Pollock in particular was fraught with inconsistency. Once How Art Writing Earns Its Bad Name appeared in Encounter, excuse me, the critical fallout exploded. It's one of the many caricatures that Saul Steinberg did of Rosenberg. Rosenberg shot back with a rebuttal the same month in Art News that he dubbed action painting, crisis, and distortion. There, Greenberg was written off as, quote, a tipster on masterpieces, current and future, end of quote, a portrayal that mocked his short-term appointment as an employee at French and Company from 1959 to 1960, where he mounted exhibitions on the work of Barnett Newman, Morris Louis, Kenneth Nolan, Julius Olitsky, and others. Apparently, formalism, with its neutral art for art's sake doctrine and basis in historic determinism, could now come in handy as a sales tool for the commodification of art, or so Rosenberg viewed it. In his counterstatement, much like Robert Goldwater, Rosenberg was intent in exposing the pitfalls of formalism's empirical strategies. He had never bought into Greenberg's ethos that, quote, art of our time is the fulfillment of the art of all ages, end of quote, knowing that historic crisis was rubbed out of any such equation. To Rosenberg, this was pure sophistry, absurd even, as he wrote in bewilderment, quote, to a collector being urged to invest in a canvas he can neither respond to nor comprehend, it must be reassuring to be told it has a pedigree only a couple of jumps from Giotto, end of quote. The real issue, he argued, was how the action painter contended with the political and social predicaments of his or her time, how subjectivity was expressed under pressure. Although Rosenberg admitted that with the end of the Great Depression and World War II, and with the minimized risk of a nuclear war in the early 1960s, some of these exigencies no longer weighed on the artist. Still, he thought there were equally urgent situations to grapple with, such as the rapid proliferation of corporate culture and the expansion of a marketplace for avant-garde art, all of which impinged on what he referred to as, quote, consciousness, end of quote. Unlike Greenberg, Rosenberg worried that these crises may no longer be as deeply felt as they once were by the artist. Any previously unimagined gains for a livelihood had been considerably reversed in post-war United States as the business and mechanisms for selling art increasingly became a staggering powerhouse. That, combined with an enlarged group of collectors, offset and muted earlier expressions of anxiety and despair. If anything, Rosenberg was now more concerned that the artist was required to become a professional, a status that resulted in his or her integration into society. No sooner had Harold Rosenberg published his rejoinder in Art News than Herbert Reed and Greenberg engaged in a critical exchange and encounter, all of which stoked a debate as to what was the most meaningful interpretive approach for art. Reed, who had been one of the Brits inculpated in Greenberg's harangue in How Art Writing Earns Its Bad Name, believed that Greenberg's vendetta stemmed from an awareness that, quote, Rosenberg had of late challenged Mr. Greenberg's supremacy in the field, end of quote. Greenberg hit back hard at Reed's smirch, contesting that Reed had only added to the confusion by skirting the question, quote, was the new American painting art or just an existential gesture, end of quote. The editors at Encounter gave Rosenberg the last word and reprinted his sally from Art News in the May issue. Redoubling on his stance that aesthetics was a moribund model, he retorted again, quote, "Art criticism is probably the only remaining intellectual activity, not excluding theology, in which pre-Darwinian minds continue to affirm value systems dissociated from any observable phenomena." End of quote. Section 3. Besides Clement Greenberg, there was one other notable detractor to the tradition of the new. Hilton Kramer, who had been installed by Philip Roth as a writer for the Partisan Review in 1953 and who later became an editor for Arts Magazine before moving on to the New York Times in 1965, wondered in his own assessment of Rosenberg's book if, quote, there was a conspiracy afoot to annihilate this book with praise, end of quote. To Kramer, the approbation from Mary McCarthy and others seemed not only excessive but unfounded. He couldn't fathom the widespread acclamation, particularly since he thought that Rosenberg, quote, bore responsibility for transforming the literary style of Art News into a comedy of bad poetry and intellectual pretense, end of quote. As an occasional contributor to Art News, Rosenberg had no influence on Tom Hess's decision to hire poets such as O'Hara, Schuyler, and Ashbery to review exhibitions for the periodical, but Kramer was hell-bent on bringing down Rosenberg to the limited extent that he could in 1959, having made his debut in the Partisan Review by pouncing on the American action painters. Kramer used the advent of the tradition of the new to restate his reservations, as well as to embolden and embellish his initial doubts as to the text's authority. Where he had once questioned Rosenberg's, quote, unwillingness to allow European masters much of a place in the discussion of the new American art, end of quote, thereby openly allying himself with Clement Greenberg's proposition that most post-war American vanguard art was given to liberating itself from Parisian debt, he now parsed Rosenberg's prose itself, arguing, quote, his gift for the epigrammatic phrase is not clearly distinct from a certain kind of sloganizing. One hopes for seeing his bright generalizations followed up by some close attention to particulars, but they're always defeated. His aphorisms are often marked by the verbal economy of the copy editor rather than the philosopher, end of quote. In his kickoff piece for Partisan Review, Kramer had become an unwitting pawn of Philip Roth, the journal's co-editor. He had met Roth while a student at Indiana University in 1951 and remembered that, quote, at the time I knew nothing about the factionalism and jealousies that had often split the editors and writers for Partisan Review into bitter rivalries. What I didn't know was that Roth had broken, as we used to say, with Rosenberg some years earlier and had no doubt been eager to publish my article because of its attack on his action theory, end of quote. He ascribed his opportunity to contribute to Partisan Review as, quote, dumb luck, end of quote, having no sense of Roth's designs to get even with Rosenberg. Roth had never forgiven Rosenberg for his trouncing of an anthology that he had edited on Henry James in the mid-1940s and Rosenberg's gnomic response, the Henry James delicatessen. The jest had evaded Roth, still stung by the implications that James was too conventional and realist a writer, what with James wallowing in the victimization of upper-middle-class women, written off by Rosenberg as too shallow a subject for the Depression. As the early 1950s wore on, Roth sought another critic for the Partisan Review, besides Clement Greenberg, who still wrote for the publication, wanting especially to cut into Greenberg's eminence as a writer, a strategy that Kramer attributed to Roth's uncontrolled resentment and envy. However, Rov's scheme backfired. Kramer fulfilled Rov's expectations by taking aim at Rosenberg's notion of action, but he let him down when it came to Greenberg. For Kramer was ultimately beholden to Greenberg's view that all formally resolved art was bound up in the production of quality, the detection of which became Kramer's critical yardstick. Even so, Kramer's understanding of art was inherently nostalgic and conservative and exhibited a reverence for tradition through his gravitation to both figurative painting and pre-World War II modernism. Unlike Greenberg, he could never get with most of the New York School artists, and resultantly his writing on the movement was thin and frequently saturated with malevolence. In one particular spiteful description, he passed off Jackson Pollock's painting as, quote, a triumph of ambition and short-lived inspiration over a severely handicapped and unruly personality, end of quote. Kramer eventually parted company with Rov over his hostility to Greenberg, only to renew his relationship with William Phillips, the other co-editor at Partisan Review, after Rov moved on to found his own journal, Modern Occasions, where Greenberg became an open target. However, Kramer never reversed his position on Rosenberg's existential ethos. When Greenberg's Art and Culture was released, Kramer opined, quote, unlike Mr. Harold Rosenberg, Mr. Greenberg has never attempted to make rhetoric do the work of analysis. His writing may not always be the most gracious instrument one can conceive for its purposes, but it has the indispensable characteristics of clarity, coherence, and logical argument, end of quote. By contrast, he concluded that Rosenberg's exegesis of mid-century modernism, quote, did more to confuse the public about the accomplishments of the abstract expressionists than any other critic of his day, end of quote. Yet for all of his reservations about Rosenberg's aphoristic phrasing, he later pilfered one of Rosenberg's most potent phrases, the twilight of the intellectuals, finding it a handy trope for his own collection of studies on Cold War culture in 1999, in which he ironically belittled Rosenberg as well as Mary McCarthy as, quote, the secret believers in the radical dream, end of quote, or those New York intellectuals who never gave up on their leftist politics. Kramer surely knew of Rosenberg's essay with the same pithy title when it appeared in Dissent in 1958, where he upbraided Raymond Aron, the French philosopher and one-time friend of Jean-Paul Sartre, for his, quote, utopian view of American life and his journalist contempt for cafe radicals and thinkers, end of quote. The thematic ties between Rosenberg's piece and Kramer's reflections on the demise of liberalism were too close for any lapse of memory or slippage. While Kramer was disdainful of any publication that upheld a socialist perspective, Rosenberg's witticisms were never unnoticed by him. In short, they impressed him, if not overwhelmed him, to the point that their larger meanings eluded him. Such were most of Rosenberg's aphorisms, colored by his early reading of Marx. Kramer admittedly did not mature as a writer during the Great Depression, the period in which Marxism was rejuvenated as an interpretive tactic. Yet for someone who was an equally facile and adept verbal craftsman and not averse to the hard-hitting or waggish quip, he remained a lifelong adversary of Rosenberg and to continue to portray him as, quote, intellectually fraudulent, end of quote. Coda. In 1962, Harold Rosenberg was invited to begin writing for The New Yorker, an occasion that resulted in his appointment as the publication's art critic in 1967. It seemed that the tradition of the new had also impressed William Shawn, the magazine's editor. Rosenberg, now finally at the age of 61, had achieved his first appointment, having been overlooked by numerous publications for such associations, frequently beat out by his rival Clement Greenberg. From his perch at the New Yorker, he continued to question the utility of formalism as a critical vehicle, always noting its co-option by the marketplace, seepage within the installations of collections at museums, as well as within the academy, where it had become a pedagogical model. As an outgrowth, he observed that, quote, an American art establishment, end of quote, was in the making, its key component a preoccupation with power, all of which Rosenberg felt by the mid-1960s had resulted, quote, in widespread anxiety, the anxiety of individuals and groups concerning both their status and that of the art which they exhibit, deal in, comment on, and create, end of quote. That the American art establishment had been in gestation, however, for a long time. For as early as 1948, Rosenberg had made a parallel observation, that of the emergence of what he referred to as, quote, the herd of independent minds, or end of quote, or the new conformity of intellectuals, writers, critics, curators, teachers, and artists to yield to the prevailing tastes and interests of commerce and its obsession with fads, fashions, and trends, or the spin-offs of formalism. Thank you.
Questions?
Hi. I'm curious with that last quote from
I can't see you. I'm sorry. Where are you?
over here.
Oh, okay.
I was just wondering, for our generation, Rosenberg is sort of not as present in the dialogue as Greenberg. And I mean, do you have a sense of how that came about, or this sort of observation of Rosenberg's that formalism was so easily co-opted into the kind of academic, or he was talking about the market, but maybe later into the academic sense. I mean, do you have?
Yeah, I think absolutely that Greenberg's ideas lent themselves to a form of commodification with his ongoing interest in a stylistic model, a model that was based on a linear unfolding of art from the Renaissance through to the contemporary period. And Rosenberg is the tougher critic in a way, but to my mind, at this point in time, the more relevant critic. Rosenberg, as early as 1940, actually begins to anticipate aspects of postmodernist thought, in that he thought he had a notion of a ruptured history, a fragmented history that begins with the occupation of Paris by the Third Reich in 1940. His interest also in questioning this whole notion of the authenticity of the avant-garde becomes present during the 1950s. There are just so many aspects, I think, of his critical platform that have bearing on the late 20th and 21st century, where even though Greenberg still remains perhaps the more accessible writer and critic, his ideas have certainly long since receded.
Yes, I think you can see that over here.
Oh.
I think you can see that in the difference between the number of artists who have been taken up by the idea of action painting versus a number who are artists who are now practicing Greenbergian painting. But I wonder if you would talk for a few minutes on the reaction of artists to the American action painting essay.
When the American Action Painters was published in December 1952, it became one of the most widely read and discussed texts in New York. And so many people, because Rosenberg refused to name names in the article, so many people wanted to be thought of as the embodiment of action. They thought that their own paintings had explicated Rosenberg's idea of action. And there was, but what artists also read into this text is Rosenberg's indictment of criticism, an indictment that centered on art, through the explication of style. And it's interesting that there were so many figures artistic figures who were adverse to that kind of interpretive model and the way in which it had been projected on their work. Does that answer your question?
Hi. If Rosenberg thought that form, color, and other aesthetic decisions were, what did you say, auxiliaries of the total artwork, why did he focus on the medium of painting itself? Why didn't he just make a general claim about art?
Well, the title American Action Painters is a bit of a misnomer, actually, because Rosenberg actually was not just unlike Clement Greenberg, who focused on a handful of painters and one or two sculptors during his lifetime. Rosenberg actually wrote about various different types of media. I mean, the fact that he's writing about Aaron Siskind in 1959 and thinking of him as an action artist is telling. The American Action Painters, even though it appears in Art News in 1952, was actually originally written for a foreign publication. It was written for Les Temps Modernes, and Rosenberg was the New York correspondent for that French publication that was co-edited by Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And Ponty had actually approached him to write something about the the so-called New American Painting. In 1952, this group of artists who we now refer to as abstract expressionist artists or New York School painters were still not named. There was this kind of contest that had ensued from the mid-1940s through the mid-1950s as to what to call this group, and Rosenberg weighs in with this phrase, the American Action Painters. But I think, part of the reason he didn't put any names into the text, even though we know later on that he said that, he was thinking about de Kooning and Pollock and Hoffman and others, is because it was written for a foreign publication, and he just assumed that these names wouldn't be known to figures in France. But to get back to your question, when we read Rosenberg's writing for The New Yorker, where he does have this opportunity to really explicate what he feels, action entails and what it means, this term is applied to multiple figures and not just to painters. I mean, it's applied to sculptors, photographers, performance artists, installation-based artists. It wasn't nearly as rigid and binding as it suggests.
Hi, I'm right here in front.
Oh, you're right there.
First, I just want to thank you for the precision and thoroughness of your readings and analysis, and also for the elegance of your organization and your own phrasing. And so this inspires me to ask what motivates your interest in this particular subject at this moment, and how you see or hope that this project can contribute to debates or issues that are contemporary?
Well, I've been working on this book, like Levi mentioned, for 10 years. And I originally got to Harold Rosenberg through my two projects on Philip Guston, both of which actually looked at areas of Philip Guston's late work, that is his work from 1970 to 1980, a period of time in which Guston resurrects caricature or cartooning in his work after a 30 to 40 year period in which Guston was referred to by the mainstream press as a heretic, as someone who had betrayed the cause of aesthetic abstraction. And Rosenberg was actually one of the few writers who was able to write about Guston with great sympathy and with great clarity. So that's how I get to Rosenberg. And along the way, I kept thinking, my God, here is this phenomenal critic who nobody is discussing. The art world is still grappling with the legacy of Clement Greenberg. It just seems that, every academic has to cut their teeth on Greenberg in order to make their mark in the field. Why not this really interesting figure who had a dual career, both as a poet and as a literary and political commentator, and then an art critic? Why is his writing, shunted and overlooked? And I constantly come back to this issue of Rosenberg's ideas cannot be commodified. They can't be pinned down in the same kind of material way that Clement Greenberg's ideas could. But that said, as I've been working on this book during this past decade, I'm constantly overwhelmed at just how prescient Harold Rosenberg's ideas actually were. Not only do they begin to anticipate aspects of postmodernism before anybody in this country had heard of Roland Barthes or Michel Foucault, but there they are, embodied in this text, The Fall of Paris, which is written in 1940. But we also have, an extremely independent thinker, a thinker who is constantly at every turn questioning the kind of conformity that corporate culture induces in this country as of the 1950s. And where is the artist situated in terms of this kind of wild proliferation? And I think that especially is something that we're grappling with today. If you go back and read the American action painters, in 1952, Harold Rosenberg is talking about fairs and festivals for art. He would be shocked at just how that whole forum had again escalated and proliferated. But the fair and the festival, that's sort of where we're at. Yes.
Yes, I just want to reinforce your claims for his continuing relevance. I'm a psychologist, and the notion of embodied cognition is a central notion in psychology. Mm-hmm. And there's basically been a movement away from a purely visual kind of view of the way cognitive processes operate also, so that his thinking really anticipates what became a key element in psychology for the last 10 years.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. Yes.
Deborah, he was also proud. He was an editor very early of the series of books, The American Guide, and he wrote the introduction to the book, the section on art, and he was proud of the fact he wrote that years before any of his friends, Pollock, de Kooning, became famous. He never named any of the people referred to, that he just generally talked about them in the article. He never named any of those people. And for many years he talked about not naming the specific names. So not naming names was not the first time in the action painting piece.
Well,
that
the
he
American
hadn't-
guidebooks were a series that he worked on for the Federal Writers Project from 1938 to 1942. Pardon? Yeah, well, the Federal Writers Project that he worked on. He was actually based in Washington during that period, and it was the first time that he went out on the road and actually saw this country and interacted with artists and writers in various states that he visited. But there's not of Rosenberg's own writing in those books. I mean, that writing was done by other figures that he oversaw. The one on art. I'm afraid I don't know that one. I don't know that one.
Hey, it's me again.
Where
Right over
are you?
here.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted for you to expand on what you meant by Rosenberg's ideas not easily being as commodified as Greenberg's, because when you look at the trajectory of art history, especially in the postmodern age when art material became a document of a process or something, they've found many easy ways to commodify art. And then we even have the phenomenon with Tino Segal recently, where there's no material involved at all in the process, but yet they've been able to sell the piece to the Whitney. So I was just wondering what you meant by that,
yeah.
and then the nature of commodification in art since Rosenberg and Greenberg's time.
Well, I think very simply, I don't think that a dealer could use much in Rosenberg's, articles to sell a work of art where he could extract huge passages from Clement Greenberg, huge passages that related to, the description of a work of art. Again, its compositional attributes that lent themselves, perhaps unwittingly, I would assume unwittingly, on the part of Greenberg, although we know that Greenberg was involved in the marketplace, as of the late 1950s. I don't know what more to say. I mean that quote that I read about this new base of collectors who can't, as he states, can't really comprehend, what they're looking at, but are assured by a dealer that their acquisition is, 2 steps away, 2 aesthetic steps away from, the work by Giotto. I think that, sort of wittingly sums it up. How do you talk about, how does somebody market a concept of, an existential concept of where you're caught in post-war American culture? I mean, that's not something easily sold, I think, in terms of criticism.
I wonder, rather than commodification, because I don't think you can really use that idea against Greenberg's writing. I don't think he really had that in mind. But I can see the concept of academicization,
Right.
because the younger critics that run away with Greenberg's ideas in the early 60s, particularly the Art Forum group,
Right.
are all academics, and they can use it.
Right. Irving is talking about a generation of critics who emerged in the mid-1960s, such as Michael Fried and Rosalind Krauss and Barbara Rose, who discovered Greenberg's writings in the late 1950s and actually contributed to the resurrection of his career in art when Art Forum was founded in 1963. And Art Forum becomes a magazine that is entirely devoted to formalist art criticism, at least from 1963 through 1971, when John Copeland's becomes the editor and redirects the publication. And unfortunately, Rosenberg, as much as he was initially interested, having met with the editor, Philip Leader, didn't have a place in Art Forum. There wasn't room for his art criticism because, again, he wasn't a formalist.
I wonder, are there instances in Rosenberg's writing, I can't think of it, where he provides a model for a close reading of a particular work of art?
No.
And is there something, I mean, it seems to me he might have ventured that, the kind of phenomenological aspect of his work that maybe relates it to developments in psychotherapy and
Right.
psychology today. if there's a weakness, if there's a problem of what could one do with that in terms of furthering criticism itself, it seems to me he leaves a certain problem. And the generation
Right.
that followed...
He didn't inspire influence, that's for sure.
in that way. And the generation that followed Greenberg, all of whom had arguments with Greenberg, finally.
Well, had falling outs with Greenberg.
Had falling outs, but had gotten possibly from him the attitude of their job involving a close reading of a work. So it seems to me if there's something problematic in Rosenberg still, it's...
I'll tell you where I
it's
think
that.
that Rosenberg's emphasis on finding another interpretive model than formalism plays out in a very meaningful way. During the decade of the 1970s, Rosenberg began to, assess just what these formalist critics were reviewing for either art form or other publications. And in 1974, there was a major exhibition, the first of its kind, that was organized by the Brooklyn Museum called 200 Years of Black American Art. And Rosenberg observed in his piece in The New Yorker that none of these formalist critics had made it over to Brooklyn to review this project. And he then went on to state very, very pointedly but poignantly that, quote, apparently formalism has become a function of racism. I mean, that kind of statement, I think, does underscore the incredible prescience of his writing, especially during the mid-1970s, when Greenbergian formalism was on the wane, but still very powerful, because it had become, after all, a pedagogical model. Most art schools were teaching through some kind of deep acquaintance with his writing, if not reputation. There were so many powerful curators in this city alone. I'm thinking of William Rubin at the Museum of Modern Art, who also enacted Greenberg's formalist views through his programming at that institution. I mean, for someone like Rosenberg to be at the New Yorker and questioning those kinds of choices at every turn was really vital. And I think that that is the kind of crisis and predicament that we're also experiencing with art criticism today. Who is that voice right now? Dave Hickey's just walked away. Where is that Rosenberg? At least there was one.
I was going to ask a similar question when you talked about Philip Guston as the artist who brought you to Rosenberg, and if there was in Rosenberg's writing on Guston, which I haven't read, like something about, sorry, is this working? Oh, there we go. If there was something that if he wrote about Guston's shift to more figurative, or like how Rosenberg talked about or described the content of the work, but I guess if he never had a close...
Well, it's interesting because, Guston was one of those figures that as he becomes overwhelmed by childhood memories in the late 1960s, childhood memories of finding his father who had taken his life hanging from a noose in a closet, remembrances of the KKK riots in Los Angeles, where he grew up as a child. As the late 1960s unfolds, and there is the election of a new president in this country, in Richard Nixon. There is a civil rights movement that is unfolded. And Guston goes into his studio and has this complete epiphany and says, how can I go, adjust a red to a blue when there's a war in Vietnam and widespread student unrest in the streets? I mean, how can I continue to legitimately advance the cause of abstract painting, and reverts to figuration, Rosenberg follows that along. He thinks, as he puts it in a key essay, he calls it a, quote, liberation from detachment, and he builds all of these social events and circumstances into his analysis of Guston's so-called, dramatic break in 1968. Anyone else?
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.